Today's same-sex marriage survey results represent a moment of extraordinary change. It is well within living memory that homosexuality in Australia was considered a crime, a sickness and a threat to the nation itself. The final Australian state to decriminalise male homosexuality was Tasmania, as recently as 1997. Plenty of gay men still remember the fear of prison terms that shadowed their lives. Plenty of lesbians still remember that, although their sex lives were never criminalized, the police and the courts found ways to oppress and harass them nonetheless. Many LGBT people still carry the emotional and physical scars of brutal medical interventions designed to fix something that was never broken. And yet, from the birth of the Australian lesbian and gay rights movement at the end of the 1960s, through the growing inclusivity of LGBT activist politics in the decades since, we have somehow reached a point in November 2017 where millions of heterosexual Australians have chosen to tick a box saying yes. In the process, they have helped a once demonized, pathologized and criminalized minority take a major step towards equality. Fighting for recognition. There is a long history of Australian same-sex couples understanding their relationships as marriages and fighting for legal recognition. But for many of the lesbian and gay activists who built the early rights and liberation movements, marriage wasn't part of their agenda. Feminist critiques of marriage as a mechanism of patriarchal oppression inspired many activists to condemn the very idea of wedlock. But I don't think it is too much of a stretch to argue that the outcome of this survey began, at least in part, in the consciousness-raising groups, protests and parties of the 1970s movement. Perhaps the greatest success of early activists was convincing queer people that they deserved better, to stop listening to the harmful lies that told them they were sick, their desires were shameful and they were destined for sad and lonely lives. Instead, queer people were told to come out, be proud and change the world. This created happier lives for many LGBT people, of course. But it also dramatically shifted how the straight world understood this evil other. It is much harder to fear homosexuals once you've discovered that the lovely women who live next door are more than just roommates. That the blokes who run the local youth agency are more than simply business partners. A generation of kids has grown up with gay uncles and trans cousins in a world where the idea of queer represents an expansion of possibilities rather than a terrifying threat. This change didn't come from nowhere. It is a direct consequence of people who burst out of the closet in the 1970s, then turned around and smashed the damn thing to pieces. The other consequence of the early movement was a tradition of organizing and campaigning that has stood the community in good stead throughout this survey. I don't want to romanticize this activist history. The LGBT community has never been a neatly united entity, harmoniously reaching for common goals. Some queer activists still argue that marriage is a force of oppression and see this campaign as a capitulation rather than a victory.